Morning, everybody. Let's get the Benny going here.
Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
Good morning, everybody. There we go. Are we streaming? Looks like it. Hey, Mona. Hey, Martin. Hang on, I gotta go wash this cup out. Be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, the man with the
Hey, Christine, Kathy, Mona, Jean, Merrill, Eric, Katie. Hey, everybody. Hey, Tony.
And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Hey, Robert. Hey, Larry and Kathleen. Hey, Katie. Happy Mother's Day all around. Hey, John. Hey, Eileen, Jean, and Patty. Hey, John. Laura, that's good. That's good. In about the same boat myself. Had about a week of swollen tonsils for reasons unclear. I gotta stay sharp for filming the next couple of days. Good morning, Mom. Happy Mother's Day. Hey, Karen. Hey, Bridget and Mary Rose. Hey, Emily. Good morning all around. I realized when I got up this morning, this thing is a mess. I mean, Dropbox is not pulling online-only files through automatically anymore due to a current build issue. So I had to go through and manually re-add every file. Kathy, I got a darker shirt, so it's in the wash right now. Hey, Tom. Hey, Gene, that does sound fancy. Morning, Lisa. Hey, Heather and Katie. Morning all around. This place looks like a mess, doesn't it? So I understand there's a website out there that says my net worth is $2.1 million. That King Griffey Jr. rookie card really must have covered things. Maybe some enterprising young man at the IRS who caused this whole pile of papers is the cause for all of this. Who knows? I don't know. Oh yeah, I had to pack this too. I'm pulling out of the stop. This is a new program. I think it might be, might work out well. Hey, Aviva, hey, Mary. Probably going to be a smaller crowd today, it being a holiday. Morning, Ann. Certainly, pre-orders are very low this week. I mean, yeah, what am I at here? Pre-orders. Yeah. Morning, Marcia. Today we are doing true crime tours in Chicago cemeteries. But while I was been doing all this Capone research for an upcoming TV appearance, and was digging through records, found this letter, Mother's Day poem that he wrote for his wife while he was in prison. But you know what else was in the files? Was Al Capone's math test from 1939. Let's look at Al Capone's math test from 1939. 6 times 6 equals 40, 9 times 5 equals 25, 5 times 5 equals 20, 7 times 7 is 28, 25 plus 15 equals 120. Hard to tell how much of this is from the syphilis and how much is just being a grade school dropout. I definitely feel like stories of Capone's intellect have been exaggerated somewhat over the years. As you know, he could write poetry. Hey, Maureen. Hey, Susan. Well, that's the question they always want to ask me. What made Torrio pick him out as the person to take over? And honestly, I just don't know. I mean, Torrio never said. Capone never really talked about it in such a way that we could believe it. He might have been a few inches smarter than the other grade school dropouts. Morning to poor. Hey, Diane. Morning, Sari. Hey, no one on YouTube. Hey, that's alright. Hey, Dad. Hey, Kristen. Glad you could stop in.
Benny Goodman goes way back and gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny, Walk. Benny Goodman...
It's not going to be a big numbers day anyway, so we'll just kind of keep it casual and relax. Hey, Trey on YouTube. Hey, Diane. Well, he knew enough to inherit stuff from... Well, by the time he got it from Torrio, it was basically running itself, other than the occasional killings. And other stuff that he outsourced to others. I don't know what you're referring to. If it's the thing about me having $2 million on the internet. No, that's definitely not true. Hey, Scott. Well, he could outsmart the Chicago police, but in the 1920s, that also didn't take much. Really, within about a year after taking power, he was kind of a laughingstock. I mean, there was the time he shot himself in the groin. But last I heard, I was at 2.1 million.
Rosetta.
Yeah, who's ever had a manager that they thought was smart? I've had a lot of them that I've had some good managers, but quite a few who were not that bright. We'll let Benny Goodman do one more tune before we get started properly. Trey, Al Capone shot himself in the groin. September of 28, he was out golfing. The newspaper said it was his leg. Medical records from prison indicate no, he shot a hole in his sack. This would have been about 10 years before he took this math test. Hey, Grandma Belle, happy Mother's Day. Hey, Sarah. And Melissa, I wonder where I'm keeping that one, too. Do they think I own my whole building? That I rent? Katie, the cats are presently on the couch back over there, both of them. You can see Priya a little bit. Hey, Carrie in the fort. L&L story on a pot? Which I don't know what the L&L stands for. Leopold and Loeb. Oh, Leopold and Loeb probably. My read on it is Leopold was in love with Loeb and Loeb kind of let him go with it. That's my impression anyway. Leopold, I think, was kind of kinky. He liked being bossed around. Thrown around like a sack of beans. Alright, that's Benny wrapping it on up. Alright, music by Benny Goodman is being presented in the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. That means it is time for us to get going properly. So welcome along, everybody, and happy Mother's Day all around. I'm Adam Seltzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours. You can see Priya and Miles are sitting there back behind me. One day I'll figure out which thumb to point in which direction. But into the third year of doing these things, and I'm still not getting that right. But all right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. Got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book, HH Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, and the recent Murder Maps USA from Thames and Hudson. Next one up will be Graceland Cemetery, Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets, coming this August. From University of Illinois Press. I'm also on the History Channel, the Travel Channel all the time. I'm flying to New York tomorrow for a Netflix thing, so I am incredibly famous. And you should definitely pay attention to whatever I say. So today we're doing the kind of tour that I can only do virtually, because it covers just way too much ground. I mean, we would be out in the bus all day trying to get to all of these different cemeteries. But this is a whole compilation of true crime tales from several different cemeteries around Chicago. And John, I have been having this cough looked at since 1995. It's okay. Chronic sinus infection. I appreciate the concern. My mother's out there to be concerned too, so happy Mother's Day all around to everybody. Yeah. All right, let's start up in my neighborhood here, up at St. Henry's Churchyard, which is by some metrics the only graveyard in Chicago. Now, there are lots of cemeteries, but if you really want to get pedantic, people say that a graveyard has to be attached to a church, whereas otherwise it's just a cemetery. Frankly, I think that's a little bit overly pedantic, but the only one in Chicago that is officially attached to a church is St. Henry's. There's also some great names in here, like here's Margaretha Sinner. That sounds like a roller derby name. Not too far over, we've got Anton Kill, Margaretha Kill, and Maria Kill. Just on the right over on the side there is Mary Kill. I really hope her middle initial is F. Mary F. Kill. But we'll move over past Mary Kill and Elizabeth Kill. Just to the side by the tree is Henry Muno, Rogers Park's first murder victim. This is back in 1886. I couldn't remember that exact date. Luckily, the cue cards are literally carved in stone on this gig. But at the time, Rogers Park was really just a collection of farms, the occasional outpost. It was officially dry. There was no alcohol, but there were roadhouses that were selling it pretty openly anyway. One day, Henry Muno went out drinking at one of them and didn't come home that night. Then later on the next morning, somebody knocked at his door and asked his son, "Do you know where your father is?" And he said, "No, he didn't come home last night. Let me go over next door and see if they've heard from him." And then the guy said, "No, don't bother. He's dead." They had found Henry Muno lying dead by the side of the road, having been attacked and murdered, and probably robbed as well. Then suspicion immediately fell on a German immigrant who was living in the general vicinity and had disappeared and had left a handkerchief nearby the body. They assumed that he did it. There's another option that they might have come across the body, tried to help with the handkerchief, and thought, "Oh no, everybody's going to think that I did it," and run away. In any case, he was never actually found, which makes this officially an unsolved murder. Now, all of this happened over at about where Western Avenue in Touhy is now, which most people would not really consider Rogers Park anymore. Nowadays, that would really be considered West Ridge or perhaps West Rogers Park. But depends on what they want to charge you for an apartment anyway. These neighborhood designations change quite a bit. That's one of the only really notable ones over there. Just a couple of years later after this, Rogers Park was absorbed into Chicago, then liquor started to flow. We'll move over to Bohemian National Cemetery. We just talked about this one last week after somebody requested it. So it's kind of a nondescript grave up here. This is a grave for a Bohemian National Cemetery on the northwest side. This is, oh dear, what have I done here? I told you this thing's not pulling up stuff like it's supposed to. I'll put this up. I know how to do it. I can fix it. That should have fixed it. And it didn't. Thought it flashed for a second there. There we go. Wanda Stopa. Now, Wanda Stopa was a young assistant state's attorney in the 1920s. She was one of the youngest and one of the only women to hold that role. Though most of the work that she did was a little bit more like that of a paralegal, partly because she does not seem to have been taking the job all that seriously. Right around the time she started working downtown, she also got really into the bohemian life. Was probably hanging out at places like the Wind Blew Inn and the Green Mask with all of the artists and weirdos. For a while, she was married to a Russian guy named Count Ted Glasgow. He claimed to be a Russian count, but never seems to have taken that particularly seriously. She fell in love with an advertising executive named Smith. He was married to somebody else. He put her up in New York for a while, just had her join the bohemian crowd out there, and she would write letters to him that just sound pathetic. It's like, if you can only see me once a week, fine, I'll accept that. If you can only see me once a month and want to stay married to your wife, whatever, I'll do that. But then eventually she decided enough was enough and came back to Chicago intending to kill Mr. Smith's wife. This was Mr. Smith's wife. But she went to the house and, in her panic, accidentally shot the groundskeeper instead, then fled, carrying with her a box of arsenic-laced candies that she was, or some kind of poison-laced candies that she was intending to use to have killed Mrs. Smith. But by the time they caught up with her, she had taken the candies herself. This is a picture of her funeral, the house on Augusta. Down it was would have been the Little Poland neighborhood at the time. Thousands of people came out for the funeral. This was a very famous story at its time. Since then, it's been on a couple of documentaries, a couple of History Channel shows since then, but it's kind of fallen through the cracks for the most part. There's only a couple of photographs of Wanda going around. Seems like there ought to be more about this, considering just how big the story was at the time. It's also one of the ideas I've got lately. I'm going to do a whole tour of people who died from eating poison candy. You got to beware of the strangers with candy. Just like they told us over and over again back in preschool. We'll stick around Bohemian National here for a second to find the graves of the Vrozel family. Now, the Vrozel family lived in the southwest side, over about where the Tri-Taylor neighborhood is now, kind of by Cinespace Studios. And they started hiring the services of a fortune teller. Hey, where did I go? There I am. They started hiring a fortune teller by the name of Herman Billick, who at the time looked like this, as seen on the cover of this book about him called Poisoned. One by one, the Vrozel family began to die. Eventually, Vrozel was implicated. They thought that he was trying to marry the wife himself, wanted everybody else out of the way, wanted to take over the family milk business. But the main witness was Jerry Vrozel, one of the sons of the family, who later took his testimony back. Shortly after Vrozel was sentenced to was given the death penalty, Jerry came forth and said, "I didn't see any of those things. I said in court that I'd seen him plotting to kill people and giving people powders, but that's just because the police said if I didn't say those things, they would pin the whole thing on me and I'd end up being hanged." This is exactly the kind of crap the Chicago police were known for pulling in those days. And eventually, Billick actually was pardoned eventually. He got stay of execution after stay of execution, then was pardoned in 1917, though he didn't live long after that. So, he's been, to the extent that he's been remembered at all in Chicago, he's generally been remembered as one of our serial killers, a fortune-telling wizard who killed a whole family. But when Steve Shookus went through to do the research for his book, he found that it was almost certainly not the case. He just got kind of railroaded. The cops had to find somebody. He seemed appropriately foreign. That was just the kind of thing they were known to do. We'll see several other examples of that over the course of this. A more likely suspect was Emma Vrozel, one of the daughters of the family, who had stuff to gain, was in a position to have killed a lot of these people, and had other people around her die who had the investigations really suspiciously rushed through. Well, that's it for Bohemian National. Let's pop over to Graceland Cemetery. There's a couple of things here. For one thing, we've got Lavinia Lane's mausoleum back there. She was the old woman who beat up a judge and caused such a fight in the courtroom, she and the judge broke several windows. I would have paid so much to see that fight. She said that the judge owed her money. The judge said that she was digging up bodies to boil them in her kitchen sink, like a regular witch. But she tends to get overshadowed at Graceland because right in front of her is Carter Harrison Sr., as seen here in this picture by Matthew Brady. Now, Carter Harrison was a mayor of Chicago for quite some time. He came back to do another term in 1893, and the Chicago Journal put out an article called "Thieves on the Run, Thugs Flocking to Chicago from Every Quarter, Carter Harrison's Nomination the Primary Cause." Their idea was the World's Fair is about to start, and if we have Carter Harrison as mayor, every pickpocket, thief, and murderer in the world is going to know that Chicago is wide open for whatever they want to do. Coincidentally, the same day the Journal published that, the Chicago Tribune published Hid in Secret Rooms, their first article about HH Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy. The Journal refrained from saying "we told you so" after Carter Harrison himself was assassinated right towards the end of the World's Fair that October. A crank named Pendergast walked into his mansion, which was the old HH Honorary Mansion on Ashland. He believed that he was kind of a schizophrenic. He believed that Carter was going to make him corporation counsel. At the time, one of the big issues was having all of the railroad tracks raised over crossings. Now, nowadays, we go under lots and lots of underpasses. Those used to be all grade level in Chicago, and people got killed at them all the time. So there was definitely a movement that we have to raise the crossings, but that was going to cost an awful lot of money. Pendergast said that he had some sort of a scheme that it would be arranged for it to be able to be done without paying any money. He was never able to give any of the details of these scenes, and he was definitely never seriously considered as corporation counsel. But when he didn't get the job, he walked into the mayor's house and shot him to death. Now, to their credit, the Journal did not say "we told you so." They had always hated Carter Harrison, but now they said it was only now that we realize how much he was bone of our bone, marrow of our marrow, spirit of our spirit, as they tend to do. I mean, even the Chicago Times admitted that Lincoln had been getting better lately after Lincoln was shot. But they also had a lot of sidebars about, well, but what about John Brown? He's just as bad as John Wilkes Booth, you know. Endless whataboutism. But Prendergast himself is a very rare case. He's a person who was hanged in Chicago. Now, if he had shot anybody else, he probably would have been found insane, but since he shot the mayor, he was eventually sentenced to be hanged. And actually has a marker up at Calvary Cemetery just over the line into Evanston. Here's him again. So there's a number of people, I've traced quite a few people who were hanged in Chicago. I think offhand, this is the only one I can think of outside of the Haymarket guys who actually has a monument like this. I guess there's probably a couple others, but most of the ones that I look up, the unmarked graves are much more the rule than the exception. Like right across Calvary Cemetery, there's an unmarked space for a guy named Buff Higgins who was Prendergast's cellmate for a while. It's an unmarked space right over around here. Buff Higgins was what was known as a police character in those days. He was always being taken in for one minor crime or another. Drunkenness was probably a common one. I mean, just yesterday, let me show this off. This is from about from 1863. This is a record of the arrests that had just taken place in Chicago. Their nationality is as follows. Americans, 615. And look how many people aren't counted as Americans. English, French, Germans, Hollanders. But also you'll notice that of the 3,000 or so arrests, just over half were Irish, like Buff Higgins. Now, the cause of this, if you break it down further, about 2/3 of these arrests were for drunkenness, drunken disorderly, or simple drunk, or just disorderly. Buff Higgins was the kind of guy who was always getting taken in for things like that, maybe some minor burglary. Then one day there was a murder in his neighborhood. Police couldn't think of anybody else, so they decided it must have been Buff Higgins. They locked him in a cell, stripped him naked, and left him there without food or water for a few days. Then finally came in, gave him a whole quart of whiskey, and put a piece of paper in front of him and said, "Buff, this is your alibi statement. Just sign this and you're free to go." Now, he was in no fit state to read a document at the time. Also, he couldn't read to begin with. But he signed it, and it turned out that what he had signed was actually a confession. He was hanged almost solely on the basis of that confession. This was all recorded a couple of years later by Judge Goggins, who did not oversee the case, but definitely thought Buff should not really have been executed. I've studied just about every hanging in Chicago. I would say at least 20% of the time I get the impression the guy probably didn't do it. And several other times, they at least, what information they had came from really underhanded methods that led to unreliable confessions at best. One other example of this is not too far away from Buff Higgins at Calvary is Giovanni Azzari. He was one of the 3 trunk murderers of 1885. Now, this was a case where over in one of the Little Italy neighborhoods, a guy had his throat slit, then was put into a trunk and mailed across the country. By the time they got there, the trunk was traced back. The story that went was Azzari and a couple of other guys had arranged for the guy to come in to have a shave, but then they just slit his throat and took all of his money instead. He was defended in court by Kate Kane Rossi, the only woman lawyer operating in Chicago at the time. Later became famous for beating up a police officer with her umbrella. There's a certain extent to which Kate Kane Rossi is a bit of a hero, though certain comments that she made in court do not bear repeating. Even like by the standards of the day, they would have been pretty horrifying. But she was about the only person who would defend Ansari. Recently, there's been a book about them as well, Elizabeth Dale's The Chicago Trunk Murder, which went through it and found that the evidence against these guys was really distinctly lacking. It was just another case of they seemed appropriately foreign, there was some reason to have a hunch it might have been them, and that was pretty much enough at the time. Now, a weird thing, by this time, by the 1880s, public executions had been over for about 30 years in Illinois. They only did that a couple of times in Chicago in the 1840s and 50s, but the police officer let so many people into the jail to watch this one that it was effectively a public execution. Like 1,500 people were brought in. They were afraid that the balconies people were sitting on weren't even going to hold. We'll move on here from over to Oakwood Cemetery on the south side. We were just up on the just over the northern border. Now we'll head down into the 60s. G.M. Shippey. We can tell a lot of stories about old GM Shippey. He was one of the chief inspectors in Chicago and briefly the chief of police before going nuts, killing a guy, and spending the rest of his life in an asylum. This is him with Johann Hawk. He is over on the left-hand side here. On the right is Coroner Peter Hoffman, who would later be the sheriff and would eventually do some time in jail himself. In the middle, Johann Hawk, the Bluebeard of Chicago, who will come up again later on. Shippey was known as kind of a weirdo. He had a very, let's call them creative police methods, not quite as damnable as some of the other ones we've discussed. But there was a case just before he got involved in Johann Hawk. There was a body that washed ashore near Rogers Park. It was up around the lake. They found a body that had been stabbed multiple times. They were able to trace back like about a dozen or so suspects. They found out, were able to trace what stable he had been at the day before. Silafani was the name of the guy. And Shippey went to the stable and rented the horse that he had out, thinking maybe the horse would lead him to the actual murderers. When that didn't work, he had the corpse propped up on a chair in the dead house at Mount Carmel Cemetery with its arm pointing out, so he could lead the suspects in one at a time to see if that sight would scare them into confessing. Or at least that's how it was reported at the time. There's several contemporary accounts of this. The practical side of it would have been very, very difficult for him to do that, especially so long after the death. Incidentally, his house is still standing. That's the Behringer cottage that was supposedly saved by cider. And just down the road, Shippey's house is still standing. While we're on some chiefs of police and inspectors... Well, here, let's start out here at Mount Olivet Cemetery. This is Inspector Fitzpatrick, who was the chief detective involved in the investigation into the HH Holmes murder castle building back in 1895. Now, this was a case where they had decided that the three-story building at 63rd and Wallace had been vacated by H.H. Holmes a couple of years before. Retail on the first floor, apartments on the second. The third was kind of an empty shell that was supposedly going to be a World's Fair hotel, but was never completed or open for business. They realized a few people connected with Holmes had disappeared and spent a few weeks just walking around saying, "We found a rope, he must have been hanging people." This was the New York World, a newspaper that had never actually sent a reporter there, but pieced together what they could, embellished what they had to, and came up with this fantastic map with like the room of the three corpses, etc. So he was one of the lead investigators on that case, the one who made the papers a little more often. And at one point he actually has a great quote. You know, nowadays I get calls all the time about whether H.H. Holmes could have been Jack the Ripper. I've got plenty of paperwork saying that Holmes was in Chicago during that period. But Fitzpatrick was asked about another local murder and said whether that might have been Holmes, and said, "You might just as well try to connect him with the Jack the Ripper horrors in London as that one." But over at All Saints is the other detective who worked that case. He was the detective sergeant at the time, John W. Norton. Now, John W. Norton was fairly new in the police force in 1895, but he would be with them for a very long time after this. Just about another 35 years. He was still involved with escorting Al Capone to prison in the early 1930s. We'll do one particular case of hers. We'll go over to Graceland Cemetery. And over by the edge of Mausoleum Row, right as the train goes by, we've got Ruth Ann Wanderer. Now, Ruth Ann was married to Carl Wanderer. One day she was walking home with her husband from the movies. Drifter jumped out from the entryway of their house with a gun and said, "All right, stick 'em up, give me all your bucks." Wanderer shot the Drifter to death, then turned to the side and shot her to death as well. Now, he had planned this with the Drifter. It was supposed to be, you're going to pretend to mug me so I can punch you in the face and look like a hero. But really, Ruth was pregnant. He didn't want to be a dad. He wanted to get back into the army or something. There's really not an explanation that's well documented and actually works to explain why he did what he did. But for a couple of days, the newspapers acted like he was a real hero who had tragically lost his wife. But Norton didn't quite buy it. He was the one whose investigations, he was almost like a Columbo-type investigator. In accounts of his investigating, he would be like talking to Wanderer like he was his friend for a while. Then finally, now there's just one more thing that I don't understand. That was really his kind of a move. And he'll come up again over the course of this. He was just attached to so many cases over the course of all of this. While we're at Graceland, we'll go up to the corner, not far from where the new Seth Payne marker is that I showed yesterday on the morning mini tour. There's an unmarked space here for the family of Henry Meyer, who was one of Chicago's very early serial killers. Now, we tend to advertise HH Holmes as America's first serial killer. Really, he wasn't even the first in Chicago. In about 1880, Henry Meyer was operating a doctor's office at the corner of North and Sedgwick, right where the Stop and Go convenience store is now. He fell in love with another woman, decided that the only way that they could be together was if he killed his wife and her husband. So this is where his wife now lies buried. We can see a few people. Her name was Ida. The girlfriend, well, they were Henry and Ida. The other couple that were involved in this were also Henry and Ida, which can make this a little confusing. Most of the rest of it is children. There's not too much of a, not too much suspicious here. There were rumors that he was killing the kids as well. About the only thing that I really have to question there is Blondine, if you look at this, was buried like the same day. One of them was buried the same day that she died, Victoria. That would have been pretty unusual. Died 723, interred 723. At the age of 7 months. That one's a little more unusual. Like Blondine, scarlet fever, that would have been very common at the time. But eventually, Ida number 2 got really sick but didn't die. Henry just divorced her, married another woman, and went on a whole spree where he was arranging for her, the new wife, to marry other guys for the insurance money, at which point they would be killed. It's almost like H.H. Holmes copied the method. In the middle of their trial in New York, a juror had a stroke and went insane. They had to do the whole trial over again. This is how it was depicted at this. After this, he was in prison saying that he was God or Napoleon or something. But Henry eventually got out of Sing Sing, made his way back to his old neighborhood in Chicago, and appears to have got right back started again, except that he got older and his bride stayed pretty much the same age. But he had a much harder time convincing them to do anything as he got a whole lot older. We'll take a quick step up from here. This is one guy I'm probably going to be adding to the walking tour route in Rose Hill. I'm working on extending it a little bit further west and shaking it up a little bit. So I've been doing pretty much the same Rose Hill route for quite a few years now. Laura, exactly what a serial killer consists of, the definitions vary quite a bit. It's usually more than a couple of people with a cooling down time in between over an extended period of time. Other people say it only counts if they didn't have a real motive, if they were just kind of driven to kill. It really kind of depends on who you ask. I generally broadly define it as people who murder people just murder people repeatedly over the course of a period of several years. This is the grave of a guy by the name of Amos Snell, who, as you can see here, was suspected of being a murder most foul when his body was found in his mansion. Now, previously, he had operated Milwaukee Avenue as a toll road. Eventually, the government decided he didn't have any right to do that, but by then, he had already made his money. He had a huge mansion in what is now the West Loop. It was torn down several years later. Got involved in a crime case once. He was a witness against a guy who was sent to jail for a long time. Then, when it came to be about the time that guy was getting out of jail, he started telling everybody, "I'm afraid he's going to come kill me." He started walking around in the middle of the night with a pistol, and then eventually the staff heard a couple of gunshots and found him lying there dead. It looked as though the door had been drilled through. Somebody had been rifling through the safe. Eventually, the suspicion fell upon a guy by the name of Tascott, who was a paint dealer, who had been bragging about robbing places in the vicinity. So the story was that he was probably trying to rob the place, but then got freaked out by Snell walking around. They had a firefight and ended with Snell being shot. Frankly, I just kind of suspect that the whole thing might have just been an accidental shooting, as was known to happen, even with Al Capone. who shot himself in the balls back in 1928. Now, this was one of the great unsolved mysteries of Chicago. It's kind of fallen out of favor in recent years, partly because we just never got any more data about it, I think. He's got a very large marker at Vrozel Cemetery. Right behind him there you can see Vice President Dawes, who was vice president under Calvin Coolidge, and a little bit of Darius Miller, who's got a really cool Egyptian grave. He was a railroad executive, and that's literally all I can tell you about him. Let's go back to Mount Olivet for a second to find the original king of crime, Mike McDonald. He was the gambler king of Chicago, was deeply connected to local politics back in the 1800s. I'm missing a couple of pictures here. Mike McDonald had a couple of wives over the course of his career. One of them left him for a priest, kind of unlucky. The other left him for a portrait artist who she ended up shooting to death. Another little scandal. Here's a cool thing. We can go right inside of this one. I'm a little unclear on who is all is in there with him. They didn't ever put names onto the slabs. Well, he would have been connected with one of our goofiest kingpins of crime, Bathhouse John Coughlin, who was back up at Calvary Cemetery. He and his partner Hinky Dink were First Ward aldermen back when the First Ward was the roughest ward in town. It was the Vice District, and if you're wondering why so many criminals were getting away with pretty much everything in the Vice District, it's because Bathhouse John was pulling all of the strings. Worse than that, perhaps, was his poetry and his songs. His big hit was a song he had written called Dear Midnight of Love, but he also did songs with titles like Why'd They Make Lake Michigan So Wide, So Awful Wide, and She Sleeps by the Side of the Drainage Canal. Ode to a Bathtub is especially good. Later on, it was said that a newspaper reporter was actually writing the songs for him, which is entirely possible, but it was also came out in a period when newspaper reporters were claiming they invented pretty much everything that ever happened. There's almost nothing more reliable in the world than 1950s newspapermen memoirs. But Bathhouse John was just known as this total affable goofball. Hinky Dink, his partner, who's in a much smaller grave elsewhere in Calvary Cemetery, was the one doing most of the actual work. Bathhouse John was just the affable frontman. Towards the end of his life, he was thought of as just kind of this no account on the city among the local officials, so they had him supporting things like Straw Hat Day, the holiday when everybody got to switch to wearing straw hats. Here he is practicing putting on his straw hat like a big boy. Another one of the people he would have worked alongside of is down at Oak Woods. You might remember Hinky Dink was one of our first Find a Grave days. It was really, really hot that day. I remember that. Took a long time and it was roasting outside. We'll bop back down to one of the other kings of the levee, the precinct captain, Big Jim Colosimo, operated Colosimo's Cafe and really in charge of most of the vice operations in Chicago in the 1910s. His first wife, Victoria, said that he needed a bodyguard, suggested her cousin, John Torrio, who came down from New York and eventually brought his young Lieutenant Al Capone along with him. If you were running a vice operation, a gambling den, a brothel, etc., you were probably paying Big Jim off in those days. But then when Prohibition started in 1920, he was reluctant to get involved. Some say that this was because he had just gotten married again and wanted to clean up his act at least a little bit. Another theory is that he knew that he'd been able to bribe local officials and local law enforcement for years, but a federal law like Prohibition, that was going to be harder to stay out of trouble on. In any case, he was standing in all of the gangsters' way and was ended up being shot to death in his cafe. The police officer they brought in to investigate was Detective Sergeant John Norton, who interviewed the second wife, Dale Winter, and said, "Well, Mrs. Colosimo, do you suspect anybody?" And she said, "I suspect everybody." There's a lot of theories still going around. One rumor is that Torrio's young apprentice, Al Capone, had done the shooting, which probably wasn't true, but certainly helped build Capone's reputation up. The more common one now is that they brought in Frankie Yale, Capone's old boss from New York, to do the shooting. That also came up quite a lot at the time. I just have a difficult time believing that Yale would have done that kind of dirty work himself, especially coming clear across the country to do it. But here is Bathhouse John leading the funeral parade. Bathhouse John saying Ave Maria at this guy's funeral. And because I can never resist this shot, a little bit more tomb snooping here. James Colosimo died in 1919. This is a typo. He died in 1920. I could just imagine the guy doing the carving like, oh, Mr. Gladstone, I've done it again. And Mr. Gladstone's like, nobody's ever going to see it anyway. Little believing that 102 years later, here I'd be still making fun of him. It's just about 102 years later to the day. This would have all taken place in May. What was the exact date again? See if I can read it on here. May 12th. Yeah, we're very close to the anniversary of this one. Now, over the next few years, John Torrio and Capone built up the entire empire, killing anybody who got in their way, while Torrio had the rule that, listen, there's no reason we need to fight. We'll carve up into territories. You take yours, we'll take ours. There's plenty of vice out there for everybody. Which worked reasonably well for a couple of years, but now and then somebody would try to get in the way, like Joe Howard would try to muscle his way into a racket and get bumped off. But for the most part, killings between the major groups were not condoned, particularly by Mike Merlot, who was head of the Union Siciliana, a group so powerful that even John Torrio would not make a move without Merlot's okay. They got to the point where Torrio wanted to kill Dino Banyan, the head of the North Side mob, who had been double-crossing him, but Merlot said no, so it wasn't going to happen. And he pops up quite a bit. There's throughout history. In 1921, there was a big move to pardon Sam Cardinella, Il Diavolo, who supposedly had been running a pool hall where he was leading kids from the neighborhood in, and then he would teach them how to commit crimes and then send them off. It was like he had read Oliver Twist and thought it was a how-to manual. Now, he definitely got railroaded a little bit. Some of the major kids involved in this had clearly been committing crimes since a long time before that pool hall even opened. So Merlot was heading up an effort to get him pardoned, or at least get him commuted to life in prison from the death penalty. The pardon file down in Springfield still has hundreds of pages of petitions that were probably set out at Union Siciliana meetings and things like that. Right in the middle, the big bold one is Frank R. Nitto. That's Frank the Enforcer Nitti, who would eventually take over for Capone. I keep feeling like Capone's got to be in here someplace. At this time, this was probably right around the period he and his brother were living in Rogers Park briefly up on Sheridan, which is one of those things I never would have believed was true. Yeah, right around there, the 6700s, those are about the right high up. It was it's in the 6000s on Sheridan. An address that Capone himself gave gave on a gun permit, and which his brother later reminisced about having lived at, which is about as close as we can ever get to confirming Capone stuff. But then Merlot died of natural causes. And this was a really big deal. Here's a picture of the crowd outside at his funeral. All of the gangsters put in huge flower orders, in particular to Schofield's flower shop, which was co-owned by Dino Banyan. A few guys, again said to include Frankie Yale and perhaps Scalisi and Anselmi, perhaps the Jenna brothers, no one really knows, walked in, acting as though they were going to buy some flowers, and shook his hand, pulled forward, stuck a gun in his guts, and shot him several times. There's a really gruesome picture of being carried out in a body bag. And there's his marker, not too far away from Mike Merlot at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Just about all of the major gangsters in Chicago history who died locally and didn't have their bodies returned to Italy or something tend to be at Mount Carmel out in the suburbs. Now, we don't know exactly to this day who was doing the shooting here. Again, I have trouble believing it would have been Frankie Yale. Some say Scalise and Anselmi, a couple of hitmen that were used frequently by the Capone gang. Others suspect the Jenna brothers, who are also at Mount Carmel Cemetery. These were some guys who worked in Little Italy, officially under Torrio and Capone, paying people all over Little Italy to have stills in their basement, which paid a lot better than working in a factory. But shortly after the death of Dino Banyan, they became deeply unpopular to the point that a few of them were killed in a quick succession. There was Angelo was killed right away, Mike Jenna was killed right away, Terrible Tony Jenna was shot outside of a grocery store. By the time Terrible Tony Jenna was shot outside of that grocery store, these guys were so unpopular that we don't even really know which gang did it, let alone which person. But at the time that that Mike Jenna was being interred, Genevieve Forbes Herrick, the Chicago Tribune's ace crime reporter, was at the interment, overheard a guy say, "There's Mike and Dean and Jenna. When Judgment Day comes and them 3 graves are open, there'll be hell to pay in this cemetery." And Mount Carmel was only getting started at this point. There was also... Elsewhere was Jaime Weiss. After the assassination of Dino Banyan, Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and Vinny the Schemer Drucci came and shot John Torrio. And eventually, of course, a few of these guys survived. Jaime Weiss, about a year later, was shot to death outside of Holy Name Cathedral, right across from where Schofield's Flowers had been. Certain tours love to say that this little plaque holder in the cornerstone at Holy Name is an actual bullet hole from that killing. It was about this location, and you can see like where they've rebuilt the stairs and stuff to cover up some of the stuff, to cover up some of the damage that was done to the church. Now, with Weiss out of the way, the best guy to run the north side was Vinny the Schemer Drucci, who was also at Mount Carmel under his own name. They called him the Schemer because he was always coming up with plans like, why don't we go steal the crown jewels in London? Why don't we run one of our guys for president? like some like some blustery gangster could ever be elected president. But then during the elections in 1927, the police were just ordered to arrest any suspicious police character on sight. They picked up Vinny the Schemer Drucci. He was shot to death in the police car while going over the Clark Street Bridge. The official story was that Drucci had been reaching for the cop's gun. Nobody was entirely sure they believed that, but at the same time, nobody really missed Vinny the Schemer Drucci. It was after this that Bugs Moran took over the North Side gang. He was manifestly not really capable of doing the job, but anybody more capable had already been shot to death by then. And of course, at Mount Carmel, the other grave that would open up on Judgment Day to make it hell to pay in this cemetery, we can't forget Capone himself. After Torrio was nearly assassinated, he turned everything over to Capone. The legend goes that he said, "It's all yours, kid," but I could only trace that back to 1953 in an unreliable source. But there he is, often decorated with some beer or some cigarettes. Sometimes people put rye there despite the fact that there's no evidence that he really enjoyed hard liquor. He was strictly a wine, beer, and aperitif kind of man. And here's a picture of the family. There's different things going around identifying who all of these people are, but that's Capone in the front at about the age of 26. Here he is at 30, maybe 31. Elsewhere in the plot is his brother Ralph, who lived quite a while later. Now, Ralph Capone's place got raided. In 1926, after the killing of McSwiggan, an assistant state's attorney that Capone was suspected of killing, Capone disappeared, and John Norton went busting through Ralph Capone's place, trying to find where all the stuff was hidden. Turned out they were stashing guns all over the place. They had a rifle being used as a curtain rod. Under the bed there was a whole bunch of stuff, secret compartments, all the stuff that was rumored to have found at HH Holmes' place. They really did find at Ralph Capone's place. I gotta wonder if Norton had a flashback at the time, wondering about the days almost 30 years ago by then that he had been busting around through the H.H. Holmes murder castle building. Of course, this all led up to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre when Capone's gang tried to get rid of the Northsiders once and for all, reasonably successfully, lining 7 guys up against the wall on Valentine's Day in 1929, but unfortunately for them, Bugs Moran was not present that day. One guy who was there is over here at Rose Hill Cemetery. Not a lot of gangsters at Graceland or Rose Hill. I mean, some. Robber barons, sure. But over here, officially the story is that of the 7 people in the garage on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, 5 of them were gangsters, 1 was a mechanic that they hired now and then, and the other, Reinhard Schwimmer, was an optometrist who just thought it was really cool to hang out with gangsters and wasn't really a part of the group at all. Now, really, I find this very difficult to believe that he would have been hanging around on a thing like that, whatever they were doing there, a pickup or something. To this day, we don't really know who the shooters were. Frank Gusenberg was heard to shout, "Nobody shot nobody. Nobody got shot. Nothing happened," before dying of having been shot 17 times. I think, as far as I can tell, the main story, making it seem as though Mr. Schwimmer was not a gangster, came from his mother. Always a good boy, Doctor's mother sobbed. She insisted that he was not really a gangster, and we've taken her word for that this entire time. It's a good place to wrap up for Mother's Day, I think. I'm a little bit over time. I gotta save the old vocal cords. So let me give a quick plug to the upcoming stuff. Coming up, we have got Thursday night is going to be Swindlers and Con Artists. Sunday, a week from today, we're going to do the Great Chicago Fire virtual tour again. I haven't done that one in about 6-7 months now, so that'll be pretty cool. The next one in person is going to be on Saturday evening, Grave Robbing 101 in Lincoln Park. Adam Chicago or MysteriousChicago.com has all of the ticket information for those ones. So, more to the point, we're going to be on the road the next few days. There won't be a 10 a.m. mini tour tomorrow, but there will be something in the afternoon. I might go track down Torrio's grave. Torrio, one of the biggest, probably the most important of all the Chicago gangsters, the man who made everything Capone did possible, is not here. He actually was smart enough to get out of the game when he did, and is in a mausoleum at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. I might go up and check that one out tomorrow. I got a couple hours to kill. And then we'll be doing some New York stuff over the course of the week as well. Should you need a Mysterious Chicago sweatshirt, t-shirt, or hoodie, go to cafepress.com/mysteriouschicago. That'll hook you up with everything that you need. Flasks, shot glasses, etc. And with that, everybody, we will just put the Benny Goodman back on and hang out like we always do. Thanks a lot for joining. Thanks for helping me with my Al Capone-style tax problem, or for stocking up on money to get more cocktails at fancy places across Manhattan over the next couple of days. Thanks for joining me. I'm Adam. Happy Mother's Day. Here is Benny Goodman. Thanks, Eleanor. Now, Kathy, no school group this week. I got another in a couple of weeks. But this I'm just going up for some filming. Thanks, John. Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Marita. And thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, Karen. Thanks to anybody new out here. There is a Facebook group called Mysterious Chicago Regulars and Miles Fan Club. Miles is my cat, currently sleeping over on the couch behind Priya, the other cat. Hey, thanks, Octavio. Thanks, Audrey. I really want this filming to go well, so I'm using 2 tea bags of throat coat today. Thanks, Kathy. In preparation, I've been been really going into the detail work on Capone stuff. I know some of the things you're going to ask me about. I want to be able to say, no, here's where that line came from. Here's what we know happened that week. And there's a lot. There's just so much family lore and local legends about Capone. Like, just a couple of weeks ago, a mansion was sold in New Jersey that was advertised as an old Capone hideout. There's no data whatsoever. It's just a guy who lived there in the 70s used to say. Thanks, Becky. At least I know how that goes. I was just remarking when I was watching that Beatles documentary with my parents. Like, this was only 11 years before I was born. My mom remarked that, World War II seemed like forever ago. It was only 12 years before she was born. Whatever happened to Frank Nitti? Nitti killed himself in the mid-30s.
And that would put rhythm in the beat of a wooden Indian.
Laura, the con tickets will probably cost about the same, $23 or so for a walking tour plus the Eventbrite fees. The boat tour will probably be in the $40 range, which is still under the going rate for boat tours around here. Now, Eric, none of the Capone movies help with getting stories accurate. And in particular, the Untouchables, though. I mean, there really was an Elliot Ness, there really was an Al Capone. That's about as close to reality as it gets. In particular, Elliot Ness's main contribution was writing a book about his contributions. Carol, the stores stay on Facebook pretty much indefinitely. I'm just going to show this again because I think it's kind of hilarious. Al Capone's math test, 1939. The one they gave him in prison. It's kind of like the cognitive test where you get like man, camera, TV. 6 times 6 is 40. 9 times 5 is 25. Now, he'd been fairly lucid for the rest of this examination, but his did not have a head for numbers. Also, the syphilis. Now, Carol, I would not suffer Ronnie to go out on Mother's Day. It's Sunday. She doesn't want to go out. I'll be totally honest with you guys. To be absolutely honest, I didn't realize today was Mother's Day till like yesterday. I thought it was later in the month. I kind of had a panic attack. Having a lot of those lately. Nah, not too bad. A lot going on these couple of weeks. Octavio, partial credit. Equals Clevin. Weather in Chicago today, Carol, is nice. It is, what's the temperature? I went for a quick walk. It is presently 58 and feels warmer because we haven't had a day this warm in a while. Yesterday was just great for the walking tour.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
Yeah, Capone stuff is so difficult to research. It's like, even when there is a first-hand account, you know, who's your first-hand account? Golf Bag Sam? Greasy Thumb Jake? These are not your most reliable sources. Most of the important people never really talked. Once again, if you want to contribute to my Get a Cocktail in New York fund, these things are right here. I love Temple Court. It's part of the Grave Robbing 101 tour, but it ain't cheap. It's like I was getting real Inventing Anna vibes from the place. And I was, oh yeah, this is one of the places she lived. Now, temperature-wise, 70s are about as high as I ever want to go. 80s, couple days a year maybe, if I'm going swimming. But over 85, it should have to retire. Yeah, room temperature 70s, that's all right. Thanks, Matt. Over on YouTube.
Eeny, meeny, miny, moe, and we stay right in the urban road.
Don't forget to check out the TikTok at Adam Chicago.
And some more to
I think I gotta put one together about the time Al Capone shot himself in the scrotum.
Eeny, meeny, miny, moe.
But alright, folks. I have got to go eat myself some lunch and finish up my laundry, so getting ready for everything tomorrow. So I won't see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow, probably, unless I find something cool to talk about at the airport. But there will probably be a tour at some point tomorrow. Just make sure your notifications, if you haven't been getting notifications every day, the best thing you can do is go turn your notifications off and then back on again. That'll usually fix the problem. But at some point over the next few days, just watch out for some New York stuff. There's definitely something really cool on Tuesday. But thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. Happy Mother's Day all around. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours, saying stay safe, stay strong, and of course, stay spooky, everybody.